Welcome to my second layout update video. As you can probably see as I pan around here, I've gotten quite a bit accomplished since the last time. I've got the bulk of the track for the yard and also into the engine servicing facility laid. I've got some of my cars out of their boxes and onto my layout so I can start sorting through them. And I've also got some of my engines down there, finally out and on the layout. So starting here in the yard, I've got my ladder tracks in, as well as 3 inbound, outbound tracks, or bypass tracks, or whatever you want to call them. They're going to be used primarily as inbound, outbound tracks, or at least that's the plan. The one on the aisle side here does have a switch you can see right there. That's going to go into probably either a small intermodal facility or possibly a transload facility or something like a team track. There is also another switch on the other end which feeds into the engine servicing facility, and I'll show you that in a few minutes. So as I try to get my tripod a little higher here to show you a bit of more of a bird's eye view. As I might have mentioned before, I use microengineering ladder track system, which for the most part I've been pretty impressed with. Compared to the original drawings that I did, that did use number 5 switches as well, I have actually gotten a lot more yard into the space I have than I thought I was going to. The majority of the tracks are somewhere between 10 and 16 cars long. The longer ones will hold about 16, which is as much as I could hope for. I'm aiming for trains somewhere between 15 and 20 cars long, so that suits that quite well. I might have to split some of the larger ones, but for the vast majority it'll be perfect. One thing that I did notice with a couple of the microengineering switches is I took them out of the packaging, and some of the parts basically exploded on them. As you may or may not be aware, they have like a retention spring to hold the points one way or the other, very similar to how PicoTrack does. Unfortunately, on a couple of them they weren't well secured on the underside, and when I took them out of the packaging, the parts basically exploded, and then I was looking for little springs all over the place. So all in all, very good quality, but there have been a few little things such as that. Also, some of the alignment of the rails between the different pieces on the ladder track have been a little off, leading me to have to kind of shove some rail through the switch. And on a brand new, not the cheapest switch, it was a little nerve-wracking. But I think we've got it all in, and it works well now. I do like the fact that they've got those retention springs for the points. It allows me to actually do a little operation even now before I have all the switch stands that I'm going to use. The plan is to use all Caboose industry ground throws. I want it to feel very much like it does, at least in the rail yards that I've seen, where the conductor is on the ground and actually having to manually throw switches. So no toggles or anything on the front, no slow-mos or anything like that. In the yard it will be actual hand-thrown ground throws. So looking down the yard some, I'm quite impressed with the amount of length I've actually been able to get. Even at like 22 feet long, I was really concerned that the yard was going to look really small, really kind of artificial, and not hold nearly as many cars as I wanted to. Now that I've been able to get some cars on the layout, I've been pretty impressed on how it's actually worked out. You could probably see by some of the cars that I have that this is a lot of what some of my crappier cars, with the exception being the train there and the very back track. Considering I've been model railroading since roughly the age of 5 or 6, for most of that time my purchases have been based on whatever I can afford, which has led to quite an eclectic mix of rolling stock. At some point in the near future, especially as I figure out what industries and everything I have, and the fact that I am setting it in kind of a modern era, I am going to have to go through some of my collection and kind of figure out what I need to keep and what isn't going to fit my plans, and kind of trim out. And any of the ones that I do want to keep that are especially from my childhood will need either Katie or Sargent Engineering couplers, metal wheel sets and things like that. That is something else I noticed with these and the microengineering switches, is that the cheaper old rolling stock, they have the really deep flanges, will actually kind of hop up a little bit over some of the switches. It's not a big deal considering I'm planning on replacing them anyway, and I wanted the more prototypical look of the Code 83 rail, so that was something that I thought might be an issue for some of that older equipment, but it's not really going to hold me up in the long run. A lot of what I am going to need to get, because I do want to kind of keep it focused on modern, I'm going to have to be getting new rolling stock anyway, and current metal wheel sets don't seem to have any problems. You will also notice that there is a bit of a bump out on the front here. I had to add that because I ended up getting a couple extra switches than I had originally ordered from the hobby shop I was dealing with. A little bit of a mix up there in the order. So instead of just having those sit around spare, I had a look at the plan and figured out if I could add another rung on the ladder, as it were. And I was able to make it work without too many problems. I was a little concerned. I didn't want to add too many to the ladder because I wasn't sure if the shortest parts of the ladder would be too short to be realistically useful. But if you have a quick look here, even the shortest ladder track could probably hold a good 7 cars anyway between the fouling points, which will suit my purposes just fine. So yeah, it was nice to be able to get the extra track. I did have to make some modifications to my bench work to make that pan out. The other thing you might notice is there is some space at the back still, and I could have pushed the ladder back a little bit, but I wanted to avoid that for a couple of reasons. If you have a look, if I pan a little bit, hopefully it'll stay in focus, where the roadbed actually is, that's going to be where the main line goes. And somewhere probably about in the middle here, there's going to be a passenger station. I'm hoping for at least 2 passenger tracks, depending on how those structures actually work out. So that is kind of the plan for that space. The other thing worth mentioning is that I don't want to make the bench work too deep. It's already a fairly high layout. It's about armpit height on myself. So I wanted to make sure that everything in the yard, if people are going to be uncoupling and coupling cars and having to read car numbers and things like that, are kind of within arm's reach. So that kind of 2-foot span for most of the switches and things like that is what I was really aiming for. The passenger track switches, those will most likely be dispatcher controlled anyway, or for solo running with an electric switch. So that I'm not as worried about. That can be at the back. I'm also hoping that, considering those are essentially going to be unit trains that stay together, that they're not going to really have a lot of problems and derailments and stuff. I can always get at it with a step stool if I need to, but I definitely didn't want a freight that I'd be regularly switching to be out of arm's reach. So over on this side, we've got the engine servicing facility. It's had a fair amount of work done to it too. Obviously a bunch of track laid. I did a bunch of work to get the transfer table in and try to get it all fixed up. Thought about making a video for that, but it didn't really actually turn out that well. It still doesn't really run properly on its own. It has a tendency to kind of twist and bind. So I think I'm going to have to actually rebuild the transfer table itself. Hopefully the pit and the track is actually square enough. You know, I was measuring and stuff the best I could to try to keep it engaged, but I think I'm going to have to make myself some kind of a metal track gauge to make sure that they are the same distance apart all the way down. Then add to that, I'll probably rebuild the transfer table itself out of some brass, make it a little bit more rigid and able to keep in the gauge, and that should solve a lot of the problems. Until then, it looks pretty, but it has to be moved by hand realistically, or just tends to bind. You can also see here I've got a bunch of my locomotive collection out. The vast majority of what's in that heavy shop is my DCC equipped collection. The one on the far left there is a old, actually I'm not even sure what brand it is, Lifelike probably. That is not DCC, but it was one I was using kind of for some early testing. It was on top of a box, so it was easy to get out. Some of those might get repaired, fixed up, detailed up a little bit, and put into service. So I'll have to keep going through the rest of my collection and seeing. As I said, especially from when I was younger, I pretty much bought anything I could afford, which has left me with a lot of kind of older and low quality and a lot of kind of partially broken models, some of which are probably salvageable, not all of which are going to be. There's a few, like my first train set, which I know the locomotive's in pieces right now, that I'll definitely be keeping for sentimental purposes, but some of the other stuff that I just kind of picked up in boxes at train shows and stuff will probably not be kept. Free up a little bit more space for the new stuff. So I also pulled out some of the buildings that I had in some boxes. Some are just kind of placed to give me a sense of having some buildings and something other than just a flat table. Things like the sanding tower, though, are probably going to go in roughly that position. Maybe a little closer, maybe a little further back. I'm not entirely sure yet, considering there has to be some fueling stands and stuff that go in there too. But that's the general location that it's going to be in. I've also got some more detailing done and almost completely finished up the heavy shop. I detailed the bricks, fixed it a bunch from where it was damaged from transport, put the lighting in it, assembled the heavy crane, and I think it's going to be a really nice landmark piece. I'm pretty happy with how it's turned out. So here's a bit of an up-close shot. Hopefully let you see some of the detail that I put in it, the ceiling lights and the crane. I really like how it pops. It's going to be kind of a display case for my locomotive collection. It's one of the first things people are going to see as they come down the stairs into my basement, and I am also hoping that it kind of keeps some of the dust off of the locomotives, or at least reduces it a little bit. There's still a little bit of work to be done. Some of the windows where I kit bashed it are not the same height as the ones that actually came in the kit. So those I still need to kind of finish up and get in, and then there's going to be some interior detailing that I am going to want to add eventually, but that'll be a project for down the road a little bit. So now panning around the corner a little bit, trying to keep everything in focus hopefully. One of the things that I have had to compromise a little bit to get everything to fit in the space is I was really hoping that the tracks kind of by the sanding tower there would be able to hold at least a 2-engine consist. 2 shorter engines maybe, but any of the longer diesels probably not. At the very least it is going to be pretty tight. Just with the curve that I'll show you in a second, I couldn't really figure out a good way to make those any longer. There are going to be hopefully 2 more tracks that go in. You can see just, well, it's kind of a bad angle, so I'll kind of point it out here. Right there. There is another curved switch and another one that I'm hoping to get that will split off into 2 more tracks. They'll be a little bit longer, which might help me out. But yeah, I wasn't able to order that switch in the initial order, so still holding out and hoping I can get that one. So if we pan around a little bit more here, see, this is where I'm talking about coming into the engine servicing facility. It has turned out it's quite a tight curve, a lot tighter than I wanted to make it. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it's at least as tight as a 22, probably even an 18, or maybe even a little bit tighter. I have tested, though, even my longest diesels do seem to go around it no problem, which is at the very least encouraging. It doesn't look too bad considering the layout height. Realistically, I'm just going to have to try it out and see if I can live with it. I think given the space and given the other limitations, it's just going to have to work that way. There is also one more switch right here that doesn't have track attached. That will be eventually for fuel deliveries. There's going to be 2 tanks that go back there for the diesel fuel, and that's where the tank cars will get spotted to unload. And over on this side of my poorly lit basement, we have the industrial area that sits right off of the yard. So this is based on both a real place and a track plan that model railroaders had in a couple of different publications, the Air Lake Industrial Park. So as you can see, I have laid out a bunch of the switches. I'm trying to kind of get a feel for how it's laid out. I've got a bunch of paper templates for some of the buildings and structures. One of the things that is concerning me is I really don't want it to feel too cluttered or too much like spaghetti track. The prototype is fairly dense, which is nice, so it kind of, we can still have a fair amount of tracks in this space without it being unprototypical, but the biggest thing is trying to fit in the buildings and making them feel not like they're scaled down too much. So I've been looking at mostly pike stuff buildings, which actually have some amazing footprints and at least from the photos look really good. So I'm hoping to get some of those here and be able to try them out and make sure that the track is going to fit in this area without it feeling too crowded. So you can see I've got a couple of the buildings that I pulled out in the background as well. Those probably aren't going to stay here. They were just used so I could kind of get a sense of how some buildings would look, what some of the footprints of some buildings would be, so I could kind of get a sense how everything's going to fit. It's also nice just kind of see some of the trains in scale to some of the buildings and see how that's going to play out. One of the things that I have always really liked about model railroading, especially kind of setting in the modern era, is that rail equipment itself is so huge. And then when you've got rail equipment that ends up getting dwarfed by some of these buildings, it really kind of gives a sense of the scale of some of these structures, some of these industries. So you can also see in the background one of my trains. This is some of my better rolling stock. Some of it is actually still probably a little out of my era, unfortunately. But we'll see what happens to it. So if we look at the other side of my model railroad here, I think as is the case for a lot of us, the part that isn't currently getting worked on ends up kind of devolving into storage. We've got a couple of the structures that I pulled out here. This one either fell apart in storage or maybe I never finished assembling it. I'm not entirely sure. But it's a nice little downtown building. And if I can get it assembled and detailed up, I should be able to use that in my city scene here. This one too is just a cheap model. I think though that if it's painted and detailed nicely, it could actually work. And I'm not sure if it was a IHC or from one of the President's Choice building sets, but I think it could make a nice little convenience store. Also in the back there we've got my wife's Union Pacific big boy. That will probably be a project in itself at some point. It runs, just not very well. It tends to kind of stutter a bit. And it's also only DC, and the plan is of course for the layout to be DCC when everything's finished. So that's going to need a little work at some point as well. Well, I hope you enjoyed my model railroad update video. If you did, please like and subscribe. I'd love to hear any comments or suggestions in the comment section down below. And you can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram. And until next time, keep tinkering.